Great. Well, thanks, Laura, and thanks, panelists, for your presentations this morning and for coming back. I'll encourage people who've been participating via Slido to put your questions to the panel and we'll do our best to get to them and upvote the ones that you like the best. I have one that I've been holding, and I think it's one, John Moore, maybe I'll invite you to respond to first, but then I'll see if any of the other panelists want to add to it. And John, you spoke a bit about having some kind of watershed scale plan from headwaters to estuary. I think notionally, people in a session like this would think, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Are you aware of that being done anywhere or close to making something like that happen? And is there something that you can point people to as maybe a model for success, or at least a partial pathway to how to do that?
Shout out to the speakers, really great point of talks. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's a bunch of sort of ongoing processes and sort of systems that are set up. I would imagine that, they probably have different sort of strengths and weaknesses. Up in Canada, DFO is leading or co-delivering some of these, recovery planning processes, and they use, some life cycle modeling type of approaches. And so that's a bit more of a technical process that's occurred in some places in British Columbia, focused in on some of the populations of salmon that are struggling. I'm not sure it's exactly watershed planning, but I think that's, one example. And then I think, some of the Washington state recovery planning processes associated with endangered species listed populations are also, not bad starting places. So I wouldn't say they're exactly watershed planning processes on those examples. The ones that I find super exciting are some of the co-governance tables that are emerging in British Columbia. And so in the Nicola, the province of BC, in partnership with the 5 First Nations in that watershed in the interior of BC, are really sort of digging into, how do we want that watershed to look and what do we do about it? And I think those type of, formal inclusive processes that allow the local rights holders and communities to express their values and share their priorities and have that be the starting place for the conversation about what do we care about it, what level of risks are we interested in, what level of risks are we not interested in, and then what are the sort of management levers that we can then mandate. So there are some of these emerging examples. I don't think there's, from my perspective, a clear setup process that's being unrolled everywhere. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here. But there are some existing examples that can be built upon.
Right. Well, thanks, John. Thanks for kicking that off. I'll see if any of the other panelists want to take a swing at that question. If you do, just put up your hand and wave so I can see you. And then Greer, I'll tee you up maybe to invite you to ask the next question afterwards. Does anybody else want to take a swing at that overall watershed, headwaters to estuary process? Do you know somewhere where it's kind of in place and working? Or is it the dream to be achieved? I'll maybe put it in the dream to be achieved bin, and we can circle back to it throughout the day if we have a chance to. But I'm drawn to the point. It completely makes sense. But having spent most of my career kind of with my sleeves rolled up in the messy business of habitat and ecosystem and trade-offs, I see it partially in place, but I don't see something that kind of connects it all together and goes all the way. So I think my understanding of worldview on this would be aligned with yours, John, that the idea makes sense, but there's work to be done to make it real. Okay, Greer, well, I'll turn to you to either ask your question or pick something from the Slido.
Yeah, I'll pull from our panel questions that we prepped for this and ask one of them because I think the folks here would be great at answering this one. You've all worked in highly urbanized areas or at least partially urbanized areas. And so one of the questions that I saw come up earlier in the Slido was some of the challenges related to that work. So how, what emerging restoration strategies work best in different cases where you have different levels of urbanization or change within the watershed? Obviously, if we can open up capacity and open up new estuary or former estuary habitat, that would be the go-to, but there's different opportunities like that within each circumstance. So I don't know if you have any recommendation from your experience on how to approach these different scenarios where you're provided an opportunity for restoration, and how do you approach that planning?
Do you just want us to jump in, or do you want to call on us? Oh, okay. Okay. So I would say I have two things. People, it's one of our biggest challenges, just the human resistance to change. And so, one of the things in Washington State that's doing pretty well is we have a program called Shore Friendly. And so it's meant as outreach to residential people, because even if it's a park, it's still the people around it, the people that use it, it's still the residents who are really the ones that you have to communicate with and connect with. And so that program is doing just a ton of education around coastal processes, shoreline change, sea level rise, moving, relocating homes, best management practices for living on the shoreline, but like just having some of those really hard conversations and hard realities. And I try to do that on every project that I work on without alienating people, with empathy and understanding. And sometimes I think also bringing in the tribal communities where these areas are important, depending on the audience, and you kind of have to feel them out for that. But it can be really powerful. I've seen it be really powerful. I've seen other times where people, bristle at it. So you have to really, it's a nuance in terms of handling those conversations with people. And I had another thought, but I lost it. So I'll let somebody else go and maybe it'll come back to me.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Greg. Oh, you're on mute.
There we go. Yeah, I was involved kind of early on with some restoration in the Duwamish estuary, which is Seattle's river. And that was when I was, still in science lab as a graduate student. And I remember when that first started out, I was kind of concerned. I think, this is kind of futile. These are tiny little postage stamp restoration projects in a big urban waterway. And it was part of a Superfund project. So the funding came from Superfund. It didn't come from funding that would restore things like places in the Skagit. So there's been some controversy, like what should we write off certain areas like the Duwamish because they're so far gone, and should we focus on areas that have that are maybe a more flagship or regionally important areas because of the high productivity of salmon like the Skagit. And in this case, it really is kind of a false dichotomy because it's the funding and the issues were tied to Superfund to tremendous in the Duwamish. But it also made projects that are super expensive because you had to deal with all these, these toxic wastes that were in some of the sediments, and so that was an issue. But also, what happened, what kind of changed my thinking about that system is that when we started with one small site and did restoration, it turned out really well. We had Carex lingui coming back, and Canada geese focused it on. We had to worry about Canada geese eating them all because this is this little green postage stamp, and they would just hone in on it because it was the only place to eat. And so there was some control efforts to protect the plantings from Canada geese, and that turned out being successful again. But the whole project, that little project, was such a success that it inspired more support for more restoration in the system. And so I think that's kind of a lesson to me, is that when you do have success, even in a place as hammered as the Duwamish, it can snowball into more projects and more success, even in places that look kind of hopeless. Now, I don't know, what the effect is on a population level for Duwamish, Green River, kind of salmon populations. Maybe it's just a small help, but yeah, I think it's an interesting extreme, I guess. And there's a paper that Cy and Jeff Cordell wrote on that. I can't remember exactly the title of it, but you can look that up. It's a very interesting paper on doing restoration in extreme urban situations.
Go ahead, John, and then we'll get back to you, Jessica.
Yeah, just to build on what was shared, like I think your point, first of all, about trying to restore connectivity is that as people have shared that salmon find it. That's always not possible, though, or not always possible. And just to build on Jessica's point, is that I think these highly altered estuaries are also where people live, and so this is a place of connection between people and nature, if we will. And so I think that work there also. I think when we think about restoration, I often think about ecosystems or nature or sort of engineering, but we also could think about sort of restoring our relationships to place. And I think these sort of semi-urban or urban places are places where the most people live. And, one of the memories that, really resonated with me once is we were in a pretty altered estuary in South Vancouver Island. We set a big beach seine. And we're on the shore sort of going through it. And I look up and we're surrounded by like 100 school kids. There's happened to be like some class that was visiting that place there. And so it's just like, all these kids were just like so jazzed to see salmon and little flatfish and all these things. And just to think about, yeah, restoration is helpful for ecosystems, but that act can include people and it can be a real way to sort of catalyze just the sort of societal value of these ecosystems.
Thanks, John. Go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, to add to that, the project that I talked about at Rose Point, well, it's on private property. There's a surrounding community, and so the neighbors have been coming out and helping with planting. Like they want to come every day and help with planting, which maybe is sometimes too much for the people who live there, But I think that's a great point, Jonathan. And I guess, yeah, when speaking to people, you do have to find out what's valuable to them. The master gardeners, it's vegetation, so really speaking to them about that component of it. Or like a lot of people are fascinated, by fish and making the connection to the resident killer whales. The other thing I was going to mention, just to kind of, and it builds a little bit off what Greg said, is I think we have to be willing to be creative and flexible and to be able to do something different. We're not always going to restore it back to what was historically. Maybe that seems obvious, but I feel like sometimes there's certain mindset that we really have to get as close to historical conditions as possible. And so, sometimes a hybrid approach is really the better approach because you can get something done faster. It might not be the biggest, but at least you might actually get an action implemented within a reasonable time frame as opposed to 20 years, from now. So being able to be a little bit flexible, creative. I know like Swimmish Channel is a place that we spend a lot of time looking at, and highly altered site and lots of silty fill material, and is going to slough and change. And it's a tough place to find opportunities, but SRSC is doing it, and I think again, you just have to be creative.
Great. Thank you. Well, Laura, do you want to pick up the next one?
Yeah, for sure. And I love that we touched in that in sort of covering that question, that human element, which often can be the most valuable resource in the realm of restoration. Getting people interested and passionate about something, and then using that passion and energy to drive change. And I like that idea of that shifting reference point. We're not always necessarily able to return to a historical condition, but just sort of be innovative and open to opportunity. I love the question that's sitting at the top of the Slido, and it came through while John was delivering our first talk this morning. And I think each speaker has then since subsequently sort of in some way referenced the dynamic aspect of estuaries. There's so much energy and shifting and change that happens within an estuary environment. So does that fast changing nature of estuaries make them easier or more difficult to restore? And that may be more of a philosophical question, but I'd love to hear if any of you speakers might have some thoughts around that, working in that dynamic environment. Yeah, Greg, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I personally think that the fast changing nature of estuaries is helpful. I think sometimes it's perceived as a problem by people with an engineering mindset. And I don't mean to diss engineers, Jessica, but people who want to create something that is inflexible, right? That's completely predictable. And it's not going to change, and it meets certain goals and always will. It's important to recognize that these systems are dynamic, and what we want to restore is not a certain acreage or, of channel, or, that's going to be there forever, or a certain configuration that's going to be there forever. But when one restores the processes, the geophysical processes that will support habitat and keep it functioning, even though it might be dynamic habitat, And I mean, if you think about, especially in fluvial systems, right, where you have floods that come down and you have a floodplain that's functional, you have the river meandering, over time, and that creates habitat mosaics. That creates young patches of recently disturbed areas that have been, scoured out by a flood, and older patches that have gone through succession and had mature, communities. And that dynamism creates that mosaic. So not everything is a mature community, or not everything is very young. And so we have habitat diversity and functional diversity. And so I think that's what's important when we're talking about areas that are dynamic, including estuaries. And I think the other interesting thing too, or useful thing about things being dynamic, is that you have the opportunity to learn, right? Because you can see geological processes occurring quickly as opposed to glacially, even though glaciers are now moving pretty fast. And so, like for example, we had an avulsion in the North Fork that's created, basically a new main stem for the North Fork Skagit in the estuary. And there's been some dramatic changes in the river. It's been really fascinating and an opportunity for learning, So those are two different perspectives on why things being fast, I think, are useful.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I see Jessica and Steve both putting their hand up, so we'll jump to Jessica and then Steve.
So I'll first say that Greg can't offend me, and that I like to say I'm a very soft engineer because I'm also a geomorphologist, so I kind of have to be. I also will say that engineers did the best that they could with the information they had available at the time, and we have new information, so hopefully we're all adapting as a profession. At least that's my philosophy, and I think most of what I see. But I love estuaries. I don't know if that came through, but they are truly my passion. And I had that privilege of doing that regional study and visiting so many amazingly beautiful and spectacular and fascinating places. And I think that they're actually more forgiving in a lot of ways, So again, if you're willing to accept the fact that things have to change, which is, that beaches change, estuaries change, like the coastal environment is not meant to be fixed. And that's what Greg is talking about by the engineering mindset. And so most coastal engineers hopefully have that mindset. Things have to change. And to even be successful, they have to be able to change. You need to allow an envelope of change. And so from my perspective, estuaries have so much more space and complexity. And so there's kind of no bad change, really. I mean, unless you're threatening somebody's home or threatening, and that's where we put in levees. Like those are like the hard engineering fixed elements that you might have to use as part of that. But otherwise, they can be very forgiving and spectacular and fascinating to watch evolve. The Rose Point challenges, the beavers came in, and I was like, oh God, could you just like wait a year until like things kind of got set and stuff? And now I'm like, I just find it fascinating. Like it's just really cool and great to watch. And so, I mean, it's my perspective.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, I guess
Yeah.
I guess I should amend my statement to say there's lots of people who are uncomfortable with dynamic situations, not just some engineers. I mean, stakeholders of various kinds, they're used to having roads being in a place and not moving, and houses being in a place and not moving, and they want other things to be in their place and not moving and changing and reliable, right? And so you'll have different kinds of stakeholders who are kind of like, what? You mean this channel might shift around? They can be a little surprised by that. And so there's a bit of an education sometimes in the process of developing a project and talking to stakeholders and educating them about the fact that dynamism is actually part of nature, and animals and plants are adapted to it and may even need it, so.
Yep, great point. Steve, you had motioned interest to tackle this question,
Yeah.
so go for it.
Yeah, thank you. So I would agree with Greg and Jessica that I think the fast changing nature is actually advantageous. Like, basically restoring these estuaries, the nature of the biotic, the species assemblages that thrive in estuaries are highly adapted to this change. So with sediment additions, they're able to grow quickly through. They're able to occupy, with the right conditions. They're able to spontaneously recolonize these restored areas because they're very good at distributing plant propagules and seeds. And so, yeah, I think it's actually that dynamism it lends itself to it almost being easier to restore in that way.
Appreciate that. Yeah, we're going to look back to the Slido, and I'll turn it over to Jason to ask our next question.
Okay, I'll pick one here that was floating near the top. It's from Sophia. She says, "Hi there. I work in the Chehalis Basin, and Indigenous communities here adaptively manage the lands for thousands of years. In implementing traditional ecological knowledge, have you had any pushback or apprehension from more Western-minded people, and how did you overcome this?" Steve, I might, just with a little bit of knowledge of what's going on in the Cowichan, see if you want to open comment on this, because I think this is something that's been real and present in some of that work, isn't it?
Yes, it has. And yeah, I touched on it a little bit during my presentation, but a big aspect of this restoration has been basically the presence of the land falls within the boundary of the agricultural land reserve. So the Agricultural Land Commission has been involved in the decision-making process, not specifically for the use of the old farm fields, but for the removal of the portion of the dike that falls within the ALR. And it's really challenging that traditional view of Western agriculture about what agriculture is, whether it's a monoculture farmer's field of forage or corn versus a more integrated system of like say an estuarine root garden or something like that. Basically justifying that Indigenous agriculture is just as valid of a land use practice in the ALR as Western agriculture is. And so it's really it's been on the forefront of those discussions.
Thanks, Steve. Would any of the other panelists like to take a swing at that? Go ahead, Jessica.
So one of the projects that we're working on is up in the Skagit River Valley, and it's a area that's now not influenced by the Skagit River. It's near Sandwich Island with Padilla Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve and the Skagit Land Trust. And so it's farmland. It was farmland that was purchased by the Skagit Land Trust and by Padilla Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve with the purpose of restoration. And there's a lot of pushback from the local farming community and concerns over loss of farmland. They have learned and adapted somewhat to the saltier soils and groundwater in that area in terms of their farming practices, although this particular land actually hasn't been farmed for a number of years, which is one of the reasons it was able to be purchased. So there's a lot of challenges there. I don't have the solutions, to be honest. I mean, there's discussion of doing some kind of trade of additional land in another area that's maybe not as tidally influenced to supplement for the farming community. It's obviously going to be further away. It's not necessarily going to be the same farmers, but just in terms of the local farming community feeling like that their land is sort of being taken away from them it's a highly political, challenging debate, in not just for this project, but kind of all over the Skagit River Valley, particularly where a lot of our farming does happen in Washington state. So yeah, I don't know that speaks necessarily to the tribal knowledge, but it is more of the pushback on that Western mindset. So I appreciate what Steve was talking about in terms of, sort of rethinking what does farming really mean, and so how can we maybe still have some kind of farming that's just a little bit different than what we Westerners are used to.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Greg, were you signaling?
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit to that, and that is, when you're when we do have we've had a lot of contentious the relationships between the farming community and the tribal community in the Skagit Delta, kind of famous for that. And I think it's important to understand where other people are coming from, even if you don't necessarily entirely agree with them. And I think, from the point of view of farmers, they have a value system that is the highest and best use of land, almost like a moral use of land, is for production of food for people, to feed people. It's like you can't do anything better with land than that, right? And that's very understandable. And I think one way in which to communicate with them, in the course of negotiations or just conversations generally, is to explain, at least from your perspective, that the production that's going to happen when land is changed, is restored to marshland, is that it's no longer going to produce potatoes or corn or traditional kinds of crops, but it's now going to produce salmon, right? And this is also food. And so it doesn't necessarily entirely solve all your problems and your conversations with people that you might have disagreements with, but it helps bridge the gap a little bit by showing that you do have some common values. In other words, food production, right? It's just a different kind of food production that they're not accustomed to. But it's not like the land, once it's turned to marshland, is going to stop producing food. It is just a different kind of food.
Great, thanks, Greg. That's a nice wrap up to that. Greer, why don't I turn to you to do the next question?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to ask one just based on what I heard this morning and get a discussion going about this. So what I've heard is really about building channels and channel networks within areas where we have that opportunity, and you really using that to jumpstart the process for salmon recovery. And is it really just about that? Is it about finding those opportunities to enhance or create a channel morphology that will support estuary restoration, or is it more than that? I mean, is there other things we know about salmon use and the importance of salmon habitat that would lead us towards additional types of restoration activities we would do beyond building the channel network? What other things are being done in terms of restoration toolboxes in estuaries that really speak to what salmon need in food webs and shelter and everything else that they rely on when they're in that environment?
I'll take a quick stab at that. I mean, I'm biased. I think channels are central. Tidal channels are central to everything that's going on in a tidal marsh, right? It's involved in the exchange of water, of sediments, of biota, and it's so fundamental to the geomorphology and ecology of tidal marshes that channels are really important. But I will say that especially estuarine ecologists, historically, we've been kind of narrowly focused on emergent tidal marsh. We're almost stovepiped into that system, and oftentimes we don't talk to people who are working in other kinds of systems in the river basin. Estuarine tidal marsh people don't necessarily talk so much, a little bit, but to eelgrass people, for example, and we certainly talk very rarely to people up higher in the basin. And there are areas, especially in a river delta, I think about big river deltas, there are areas that we neglect entirely that should still be in our purview. For example, tidal shrub and tidal forest communities, partly because they're relatively rare, but partly because they're also hard to work in. It's, some of these shrub communities are just thickets. And some of the tidal swamp systems are so hard to get around in a boat because you've got logs in the channels, and on foot because there's just so much water everywhere. It's hard to move around in there. So we need to think really on a landscape scale about how, the continuum of habitat from eelgrass to up into floodplains that are not even tidal. The fish, especially salmon, they're using the whole landscape. And so and things are flowing from one part of the landscape to the other part of the landscape, either in floods or just general river flow or in tides. And so there's a lot of interaction. And one of the things we're finding, for example, that Melanie Davis has been doing in the Nisqually, for example, is that, the tidal shrub communities are highly productive of insect prey for juvenile salmon. And yet we know so little about tidal shrub communities because we've just done so little research in those areas. We've spent so little time in those areas. So I would say, thinking of things on this landscape scale, I think is really important, and how different parts of the landscape interact, geomorphologically and ecologically.
Thanks, Greg. having been in a boat trying to navigate those areas.
Oh yeah,
I know
yeah.
what you're trying to say in the Columbia Estuary.
When I was a graduate student in the Chehalis, which is a Sitka spruce swamp, tidal floodplain, I remember I went into one site way up Blue Slough, which is one of the larger sloughs there. It's like a 5 kilometer long slough. I went way up there to do some work way up there, and the tide dropped as I was up there, and there was a submerged log that was now blocking my exit. So I had to wait for the tide to come back up, like overnight, to get out of there. So yeah, those places are hard to get around in.
So
Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I think that one of the reasons that there's so much of a focus on the channels is because you have to realize that tidal currents are not that powerful, like especially in like pocket estuaries or, way out on the deltas. And so, tidal currents aren't really sufficient to carve, the tidal currents aren't sufficient to carve tidal channels in most situations, especially depending on how heavily compacted it is, and a whole bunch of other factors. But there's been a number of locations where not enough channels were put in and they don't form on their own. So that's one of, I think, the primary reasons there's such a focus on like, we need to build these channels because they're not going to do it themselves. Whereas like vegetation, it can colonize on its own to a certain extent, or you can go in and plant later, right? It's way harder to go back in later and then excavate additional channels also. So really doing it at the forefront of the project is really important. I saw that there was a question about wood. I feel like wood is kind of similar. Like the way that we treat wood is like more wood is better. And so as much wood as we sort of can afford, because there's such a deficit of wood just in the entire Salish Sea for, a variety of reasons. They clear it for navigation. There's not as many trees falling, all those sort of things. And so if we can, and I know Greg has opinions about wood as well, but we generally take the approach like we'd like to bury some wood. We want to place some wood. I will say again at Rose Point, just as because it's like the thing that's the most forefront of my mind. I'm out there all the time, checking it out, seeing what's going on. Is a lot of the wood that we placed in the near shore on the barrier spit has now made its way into the estuary. Fine, great, no problem. In the systems that we visited, like there was a number of places, again, to the complexity where there might be a big root wad sitting right in the middle of a channel, and it had created this beautiful, complex area and pool around it, and it wasn't, hurting anything. It's fine for it to have the scour pools, inside of the estuaries. We don't like them out on the beach. So that's why we don't anchor wood, out on the beaches, because we don't want to create big scour holes out on the beach themselves, because that weakens the barrier spits. But burying wood that will eventually maybe erode and remobilize, fine, great. So just kind of emphasizing why channels, I guess, why we spend so much time talking about channels.
Thanks, John. I was hoping you were going to raise your hand, so I'll give you the last answer to this one, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I just want to echo, first of all, I think the channels are sort of setting the stage for, restoring those processes that they would underpin everything. And so I think that that is sort of, of paramount importance if it's feasible, given the sort of constraints of the infrastructure around that. But I do think, in addition, I'm sure others agree, there's this pretty diverse portfolio of opportunities and options out there that you see out there, and those of course should be sort of tailored to the stressor or the challenge that the estuary is facing. And some of the ones that I've sort of seen are, in some places there's a lot of Canadian geese and they're ripping out the vegetation, and that's leading to erosion. And so just like, all right, geese are the stressor, let's try to exclude them somehow. In some other estuaries, there's a ton of harbor seals and their populations have exploded. And so they're hanging out on log booms and they're eating a high proportion of the Chinook salmon. And then, in places that are super urbanized, like I think some of the work from Jason Toft and team in South Puget Sound that has like, soft seawalls and just trying to soften the shorelines in these heavily urbanized systems are also, just trying to sort of incrementally, give more space and more opportunities for the fish and the ecosystem. So I think the portfolio of options is quite broad, and tailoring that to the estuary seems like what people are doing.
Thanks. I'll hand it back to the studio to transition us to lunch, because I think we're out of time for the panel discussion.
Great, thanks, Greer. And with John making a plug for Jason Toft, that just reminds me that Jason was one of our speakers in our nearshore restoration workshop that we did just over a year ago. And so a reminder that we've got this library of recordings from past workshops, and I'd invite anybody to jump into that, jump into the website, and you can find Jason Toft's specific presentation among others that really kind of, I think, contribute to the conversation and dialogue we've had this morning. We're going to move into lunch, and I just would like to invite any of the speakers on the panel, if there's any sort of burning last thoughts or advice that you'd love to share with our audience. I'll just ask that you keep it quick to sort of a 30-second closing, but I'll just move through each on our panel and see if you would like to share anything. I'll start with you, John, since we just, you had the mic there a moment ago, if you had any last thoughts.
I just want to thank you all for bringing us together for this conversation. I really appreciate the other speakers and also everybody tuning in from afar. And thank you all for your amazing work. I think it is important. And I'll reiterate that I think, work in the estuaries can have benefits that spreads far and wide. So thanks all.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Greg, if you've got any closing thoughts.
Yeah, I'd like to give my thanks also for the invitation to talk here. And I'd like to say, we need to have some confidence in that we know what we're doing when we do restoration, but we also need to have some humility in that we need to recognize that there's a lot we don't know. We have a lot to learn from, and I think it's important to recognize and admit when things don't work out the way we expected them to or hoped for them to, because those are learning experiences. And I think there's some reluctance sometimes to say that a project didn't work out the way you want because of sometimes political or social consequences of saying a project wasn't perfect, but I think it's very important to recognize that those are learning experiences, and we're still learning. We still have a lot of learning to do.
No, I love that. Great point to make. Thank you. Jessica, any last thoughts?
Yeah, and I'll echo what Greg said, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very grateful for it. As I said, this is a very I'm very impassioned about estuaries, and so on that note, I would also say please reach out. We're a 10-person company. We love to collaborate. I am always happy to have a conversation about estuaries over lunch or coffee or whatever it is, and the knowledge sharing that's been happening with BC on nature-based coastal solutions we've been involved with, as well as with this community. And so, yeah, and if you know any young engineers, tell them to go be coastal engineers. It's an amazing program at Oregon State University and UBC, and we just need more. We need more of us. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for bringing your passion to our workshop today. It certainly came through in your talk and what you've contributed today. So I'm really grateful for that. Steve, any last thoughts before we go to lunch?
Yeah, just want to say thank you for the opportunity to showcase our work as an organization and our ongoing estuary resilience initiative. It was great to be amongst the other speakers here and hear how their work dovetails with ours. And thank you to the organizers for putting on such an awesome series. It's a really great wealth of knowledge that I'm looking forward to tapping into the recorded series as well. So thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And thanks to all our panel members this morning. Super grateful for what you've contributed.